Okay, let's turn to Shalom Aleichem on page 13b. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hasharei, Malachei Elyon, Melech, Malachei Amalakim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem L'Shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Melech, Malachei Amalakim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. L'Shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Elyon, Melech, Malachei Amalakim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem L'Shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Elyon. I borrow Sydney your Okay, this call on Liliana, Anna, Sydney to come up and light Shabbat candles. And the ladies online could also participate. Arlene, where's Arlene? You can join if you want.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lekarlik ner shel Shabbat. Amen.
Give each other a hug and give each other a blessing.
Oh,
All right, let's turn down to page 16. May the door of the synagogue be wide enough to receive all who hunger for love, all who are lonely for fellowship. May it welcome all who have cares to unburden, thanks to express, hopes to nurture. May the door of the synagogue be narrow enough to shut out pettiness, pride, envy, and enmity. May its threshold be no stumbling block to young restrained feet. May it be too high to admit complacency, selfishness, or harshness. May the synagogue be for all who enter the doorway to richer and more meaningful life. Va'ani lati lecha Adonai eich ratzon Elohim v'ro chazdecha anei me'emet yishecha. Let's turn now to L'chon Ranana, which is a very, very mystical prayer, and emphasizes the importance of movement in spirit. You know, one of the worst things that can happen to a person, according to Jewish mystical teachings, is when people stay stagnant and stationary. Please be seated, make yourself comfy. And so when you think about things that are stagnant or stationary, what comes to mind?
Water.
What?
Water?
Water is always moving. What else comes to mind? Yes? Cars are always moving, but what's staying still?
Lifeless things.
For instance?
Tierra.
Well, the earth is moving.
Yeah, the earth is
Oh, we may not notice it, but it is moving. But what about a rock?
a rock.
If I put a rock down, what's going to happen? It's going to stay stationary. And so when it comes to the life of spirit, things that are alive are always moving. If you ever see a picture of an atom, what will you notice? What does an atom consist of?
Always moving.
It consists of a proton, neutron, and electron. Of course, you have many other smaller parts. But if you take a look at an atom, it might seem like it's stationary, right? But if you look with the eyes of let's say, an electronic microscope, if you could see the atom in movement, I mean, in reality, you'd see that it's energy that's always dancing. And so when we talk about God's creation, we're also emphasizing how creation is always in the state of movement. And that's why we chant this prayer, Lechu Neranana. Lechu Neranana, Lechu Neranana, Lechu Neranana, Lechu Neranana, Now we're going to turn to Lechadodi, page 40. Lechadodi, Vikatala, skip the first verse. This are again. Amor v'amor Third verse. Page 42. He holy, he holy, he holy, 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 holy. She's a baby, Kavanaya Lecha, Rohi, no longer thou like a city all friend. And you tell your children, all people tell, out of your ashes you can be reborn. Let Okay, now I love my place. Jesus spoiled. Your clothes will be roused and their flocks will be spoiled. In you on your God find joy and pride. Love you, your record, love you, God. Let us be. Every way may you prosper and grow. Reverence for God that you ever know. May you see redemption. He will bring songs of thanksgiving in you. Let us be. Let us be. Okay, now let's turn now to the last verse on page 43, 42. Please rise as we greet the Shabbat bride. Oh, give it shalom, Aseret Allah, Simcha, Yushalom, Tov Emulei, Amtu Gula, Boikala, Boikala. Lecha, Rohi, Hello, Kenesha Bonika, Hello, Lecha, Rohi, Hello, Kenesha Bonika, Hello, thou Shabbat, the day divine. Come enjoy, let your brightness shine. Come to the people who greet you with pride. Come and peace, Shabbat. Let us go easy. Let us go easy. Okay. From the mouth. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat to my sister Jeannie, and to Jeanette, and Rochelle, and Adam Chrysler, and Antonio, and Anthony. Anthony, how is business and show business? How's show business in Los Angeles? You know what they say about show business? Show business is related to shul business. And it's also related to school business. So, what is the great wisdom of our tradition say about this? There's no business like shul business. And if you're a teacher, it's school business, or if you're in Hollywood, like show business. My brother is, he lives in Los Angeles, and he's an aspiring actor. And he gets a lot of minor roles in different films, and he's pretty happy because he's 72 years old. I guess he does not expect to get a major role, but you never know. But he's been at it for the last 40 years. Let's turn now to the song of Shabbat, and Shabbat Shalom George, and Alberto, and Randall. Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, Tovodo Ladonai, Uzamer L'Shimcha El Yom, Uzamer L'Shimcha El Yom. That's some records. Nagid Babo Techazecha, Ve'emunata B'Leilo, Alei Yashur, Ve'alei Na'avel, Alei Gayom, Ve'chivon, Yizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, Tovodo Ladonai, Uzamer L'Shimcha El Yom, Uzamer L'Shimcha El Yom. Yisratani Adonai V'Halecha, V'Maseh Yadecha Adonai Ekein, Ma'godu Ma'asecha Adonai, Me'od Truma B'Votecha, Yizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, Tovodo Ladonai, Uzamer L'Shimcha El Yom, Uzamer L'Shimcha El Yom. Last verse. All you live, let's say God, let's say Giver and the name let us be Adonai to the law of what the holy not in Now it says, planted in the house of the Lord, they will flourish in the courts of our God. They will yield fruit even in old age. They will remain vital and vigorous, proclaiming that the Lord is just, my rock in whom there is no unrighteousness. So this teaches us many things. Number one, we need to plant our children in God's home. And if they get used to attending the synagogue and make Judaism a part of their daily life, it'll be the kind of faith and religion that they can grow old with. Let me tell you an interesting story. When I was a yeshiva student in Israel, there was the rabbi of the village who was about the same size as Marie Sackett. and he was 105 years old. And he might have lived much longer, except for one little problem. He was killed in an automobile accident with 4 or 5 other people. I knew the family. One of the children was engaged. He got killed at age 21. And here you have someone who's 105, and you wonder at times. But the interesting thing about this old rabbi is that he would walk to the synagogue every day, and he would walk like this. It would take him forever to go 10 feet even. But he was very consistent.
Wow.
But I must tell you, he had a mind that was exceptionally sharp. And one of my best friends used to study with him, and he had a great deal of difficulty keeping up with him because his mind moved like greased lightning. Okay, so let's turn now to the Baruch Hu on page 52. Everyone, please rise. Let's turn now to page 60. Avad Olam Beit Yisrael. With everlasting love, you have loved your people Israel. Ki hem chayeinu v'oret yameinu u'lahem negeyam v'layla. Ki hem chayeinu v'oret yameinu u'lahem negeyam v'layla. Ki hem chayeinu v'oret yameinu u'lahem negeyam v'layla. Is it hot here, or am I just imagining it?
It's a little
You feel a little hot?
muggy.
Muggy. All right, let's turn to the Shema. Let's turn to, you know why it's hot? Because our prayers are full of energy. Yes, we're creating heat. Of course, heat in the middle of summer is not necessarily a good idea. Okay, put your right hand over your eyes, and we say the words together. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי בסוף היום על לבבך ושנתיים לבניך ודיברת בם ושבתך בביתך ובתך בדרך ושופך וחמך וקשתם אותם ידיך ויהיו שותפות בעיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. George, are you there, George? Why don't you lead us in the prayer Listen on page 74.
Judaism begins with the commandment, "Hear, O Israel." But what does it really mean to hear? The person who attends a concert with a mind on business hears, but does not really hear. The person who walks amid the songs of birds and think only of what will be served for dinner hears, but does not really hear. The man who listens to the words of his friend or his wife or his child and does not catch the note of urgency, "Notice me, help me, care about me," hears, but does not really hear. The person who listens to the news and thinks only of how it will affect business hears, but does not really hear. The person who stifles the sound of conscience and thinks, "I have done enough already," hears, but does not really hear. The person who hears a Hassan pray and does not feel the call to join in prayer hears, but does not really hear. The person who listens to the rabbi's sermon and thinks that someone else is being addressed hears, but does not really hear. On this Shabbat, O Lord, sharpen our ability to hear. May we hear the music of the world and the infant's cry and the lover's sigh. May we hear the call for help of the lonely soul and the sound of the breaking heart. May we hear the words of our friends and also their unspoken pleas and dream. May we hear within ourselves the yearnings that are struggling for expression. May we hear you, O God, for only if we hear you do we have the right to hope that you will hear us. Hear the prayers we offer to you this day, O God, and may you hear, and may we hear them too.
And what this teaches us is that prayer is not just a matter of speaking to God, but prayer is really more about learning how to listen to God. And we find in the Talmud that it says that as we say the Shema, as we pray to God, God prays to the Jewish people. And it's an interesting connection. Human beings and God are trying to communicate. But the essence of communication is a willingness to listen. And that's what Shema is all about. Let's turn to the end of the Shema, which talks about the Exodus, and remember the Exodus every evening of our life. L'ma'an tizkaru v'asitem ekom v'tzitai v'yin kadoshim alechem ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim yod lachem le'elohim ani Adonai Elohechem Amen. Everybody make eye contact with your neighbor or look online and make eye contact with your cyberspace buddy. Adonai Elohechem Amen. Your God is a God of truth. Okay, let's rise and turn to page 86. Okay, let's have a little bit of energy in motion, emotion. And no, okay, Let's turn down to page 90. Please be seated. Prayer for peace. Why is that so necessary? Well, because it's amazing how much conflict there is in the world, all around us. There is scarcely a time or year when we don't have war. You know, there used to be a period in Roman history called Pax Romana. What is Pax Romana? Roman peace, where supposedly nobody fought against each other for a period of approximately 200 years. Well, but since the Roman Empire, we've had wars in just about every century. And it seems like that's part of our nature. And by the way, you might be surprised to know that chimpanzees also engage in war. Sometimes very violent war. Sometimes even genocide. Isn't that amazing? So it seems as though our violence may be something, our propensity towards violence may be a part of our basic nature. But the good news is human beings can always rise above their biogenic programming. We are more than the sum of our biological parts. So let's pray for peace. Ashkevenu Adonai Eloheinu, Shalom, Shalom. V'amideinu Mokeinu L'chayim, Shalom, Shalom. V'vros Aleinu Sukkot Solecha, V'vros Aleinu Sukkot Solecha. Amen. Shelter us beneath your wings, O Adonai. Guard us from all harmful things, O Adonai. Keep us safe throughout the night, till we wake with morning's light. Teach us, God, wrong from right. Amen. 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 V'vros Aleinu Sukkot Solecha, V'vros Aleinu Sukkot Solecha. Amen. Rabbi Tadonai, Aperisa Kashon, Aleinu Kam Moisha, V'yal Yerushalayim. Let's all stand up and have a little bit of movement. V'shamru. On page 96. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro, quatre, maraca. Kassamai, Yet Uvayom Hasi, Shabbat Vayinavah, Shabbat Let's turn now to the half Kaddish on page 106, 108 actually. Yitkada, Yitkada, Shalom, V'yaman, V'atu, Shagim, and Mafutei, V'chayechon, V'yamechon, V'chayechon, V'yisrael, V'agala, Yisman, V'yimu, Yesh Me'ra, V'mevora, Yom Me'omaya, Yivarach, Vishkabah, Vipadi, Kumon, Vitnasei, Vihadar, Vitalitalo, Shemen Kutra, Vihu, Veyam, Abrachata, Vishirata, Tuzbechota, Nechamata, Da'amira, Yamo, Amen. Let's turn to the shortened version of the Amidah, which you'll find on page 128. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei Avotenu, Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, Elokei Sarah, Elokei Rivka, Elokei Rachel, Elokei Leah, Haggadah, Hagibor, V'Nara Elyon, Kodei Shemayim V'Aretz, Magen Avot V'Tadon, V'Chayei Meitim V'Mamazon, Ha'el Kadosh V'Yein Kamon, Amen Yahweh, Yom Tovat Kocho, Givon Ratzah, Narniach Lachem, V'Chadav Navod, Yirah V'Pachad, V'Nogen Lishmo, V'Chol Yom Tov, Ha'Brachot, little reggae, Elo Za'ot, Adon Ha'Za'avon, Mekadesh Ha'Shabbat, V'Moret V'Zivi, Regi Yadigusa, Yadigusa, Oleh, Zeker L'Ma'aseh, page 130. Eloheinu, Elohei Avoteinu, Ritzei, B'Nuchateinu, Kachenu B'Mitzutecha, V'tein Chalkeinu B'Toratecha, Saveinu Mituvecha, V'samachenu B'Yeshuatecha, V'tahil Liveinu, V'yavlecha Mi'emet, V'yanchilenu, Adonai Eloheinu, V'yahava u'ratzon, Shabbat kodesh v'yikuvo Yisrael, Mekadeshei Shemecha, Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat. Let's turn now to page 134. This is called the Kaddish Shalom, not to be confused with the mourner's Kaddish, even though they share many of the same words. Kaddish introduces a prayer, so that's what the half Kaddish does. Kaddish Shalom concludes the prayer. You can be seated if you want. And then you have the mourner's Kaddish, the rabbi's Kaddish, and the burial Kaddish, and I'm sure they'll probably invent several other kinds of Kaddish before my lifetime is finished. So let's turn now to page 134. Yitkada v'Gadash v'Rabah, v'Yamar v'Baruch v'Tei v'Yamar v'Chotei, v'Chayechon v'Mecha v'Chaylecha v'Yisrael v'Galav v'Smakari v'Yamei, Yesh Me'ra v'Mevora, Yom Le'Maya, Yivarach v'Yishtabach, v'Yita'avi Kerman v'Yinasei, v'Yadar v'Talei v'Talal, Shemei v'Tzav v'Rechu, Le'lam v'Kol v'Chata v'Sharata, v'Shachata v'Nehemata, Amen. Tifta Betzalota, Uva Uva, Israel, Shadam Lazuam, Vishemaya, Amen. Yeshom Rabba Nishmaya, Lechayim Aleinu, Le'al Kol Yisrael, Leinu Amen. Osher Shalom Minamas, Avuya Shalom Aleinu, Le'al Kol Yisrael, Leinu Amen. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'akol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'akol Yisrael. Queda la paz, paz sobre nosotros y sobre Israel. Queda la paz, paz sobre nosotros y sobre Israel. Lay Shabbat on Mamacita. Okay, good. Excellent. This is very interesting Torah portion. You know, I often wonder if Moses would have had a vision of all the heartache that the Israelites were going to give him over the span of the next 40 years of his life, would he have accepted the choice to be Israel's prophet and champion who led his people out of Egypt? Would he have turned the job down if he would have known how difficult it was going to be? And yet we know that Moses was not privy to that. And he discovered the job was certainly a lot harder than he imagined. Because there's an aspect about the book of Numbers that's very interesting. In some ways, it's very contemporary. Does anyone know what a kvetch is? What is a kvetch? A chronic complainer. Now, kvetch is Yiddish, but it's also Hebrew. It comes, it basically comes from the root word, which means to be uptight. How do we respond to difficult people? This is a valuable question. When you're struggling with difficult people at work, they can make your life very, very challenging. How do we respond? Do we respond tit for tat? Do we treat others the way they treat us? Or does the Torah commend a higher ethic? And so, when we look at Moses' capacity to deal with difficulty, we find that Moses is a very humble person. And in this week's Torah portion, we come across the most remarkable passage, perhaps in the entire book of Numbers. It says that Moses was Ish Anav. He was the humblest man al Panei Hadamah, on the face of the earth. Now, why did the scriptures tell us that? Well, you may recall that when Moses was feeling upset that he didn't have any help, God gave him assistance. And Moses gifted them with the ability to prophesy. And the story goes that two of the prophets, in particular, were, according to rabbinic tradition, prophesied that Moses was not going to lead the Israelites to the promised land. And Joshua tells Moses, please put an end to their prophecy. Let them not prophesy anymore. And what did Moses say? How have I? Oh, it should be that the entire people should be privy to the experience of prophecy. And this is a characteristic that we find about Moses that's very endearing. He did not begrudge the gift of prophecy to other people. He wanted everyone to have the kind of experience that he was privy to. And this is interesting. When we talk about humility, how do we become humble people? And this, I think, is a valuable question which we could ask here. The Kotzker Rebbe was a very famous rabbi of the 18th century, and he had zero tolerance for people who are less than authentic individuals. And you know, the Kotzker Rebbe used to say, if you have to prepare yourself to be humble, guess what? You're not. If you have to try to be humble, you've missed the boat. You've missed the bus. You've missed the point of what it means to be humble. Humility is something that comes natural to people. And we cannot fake our way by appearing to be humble in front of others. It's like the old story. George knows this story quite well because he's heard me tell it before. It was about the rabbi, the cantor, and the shamus. And on the Jewish New Year, the rabbi opens the ark and he says in Yiddish, "Ich bin a garnish, I'm a nothing. Yo soy nada." Did I say it correct? Yeah. Okay. Now the cantor, not the most humble person in the world, but he wasn't going to let himself be outdone by the rabbi. So what does he do? He stands in front of the ark and he sings in a cantorial voice. But instead of singing in Yiddish, we're having to sing in Spanish. He says, "Yo soy nada también." I'm also a nothing. And then the caretaker, basically the janitor of the synagogue, is truly inspired by this feat of humility. And what does he say in front of the ark? He says, "Oh God, ich bin garnished. Ich bin yo soy nada también." But he really meant it. And the rabbi and the cantor look at each other and they say, "Look who thinks he's a nada. Look who thinks he's a nobody. Look who thinks he's so insignificant." And the story kind of highlights that when we try to be humble, we're not. But the question is, what is it that makes Moses so humble? And the answer, as I mentioned before, he does not begrudge the accomplishments of any person. In fact, he is of the view that if any person would have had the same opportunities he experienced, they would probably do a better job than him. Moses was really perplexed by God chose him to lead the Israelites. And he really felt that there were much more capable people. And that's an important lesson here. You know, when we look at human traits, arrogance is really very, very problematic. In fact, in Spanish, you say arrogante. What is it about arrogant people that we don't like? They over-exaggerate their own positive strengths, and they tend to put down other people they consider to be inferior. So what is the characteristic of a humble person? Well, when you go to a restaurant, you can discover humility in terms of how you treat a waiter or a waitress. Now, a lot of these people don't make terribly much money. And do you look at the waiter as someone who's inferior to you? Or when you look at the waiter, do you think, or do you see that person as a human being who's much like yourself. And our tradition teaches us that we should never forget our humanity. And that just because a person may not be the president of the United States, or he's not a CEO, does not mean that he's necessarily insignificant. Did I ever tell you the story about the Israeli bus driver and the rabbi that died and went to heaven? And they were being judged by God. So the first person who's judged is the bus driver. And the Archangel Gabriel says, "You, sir, can go straight to heaven." Now the rabbi looked at this and he said, piece of cake. If this person can go to heaven, how much more so will I? And the angel looked at the rabbi, because it was his turn, and he says, "And you, el Rabino, beta el infierno, mi buen amigo." You can go straight to the devil. So the rabbi protested. What about all the sermons I gave? What about all the lessons of Torah I shared with my students? Why can't I go to heaven? What does this lowly bus driver mean to God? And the angel said, "Habibi," this popular Israeli expression, my dear friend, when you gave your sermons and when you taught your Torah, you put everybody around you to sleep. You did not give inspiration to anyone. But when this bus driver started driving, all of a sudden he inspired the entire bus to pray to God. I mentioned this story to illustrate that sometimes we're not as great as we think we are. Sometimes the other person might be more highly valued in the eyes of heaven. And there's an interesting analogy that we find in the Abrahamic blessing. That God says, I will make your people like the stars of the heavens. So, what is the characteristic of a star? A star looks very small. But what happens when we approach the star? It gets larger and larger and larger. In fact, this modern astronomy has shown that there are planets that are maybe 100 times larger than our sun. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
But when we look at it from the naked eye, it doesn't look very, very great at all. And so when we judge people, we have to be careful that we don't think that we're superior to our neighbor. So how do we become humble? And this is a valuable question. One way to be humble, or to strive towards humility, is to be open-minded. Be open-minded to wisdom. Don't think that just because you're God's chosen person, that you're better than someone who isn't. We don't know how God looks at different people from different traditions all around the world. And don't think you know all the answers. Never, ever be afraid to say, I don't know the answer to a question. That's humility. Another aspect of humility is the willingness to learn from everybody. So we find in Pirkei Avot, Ben Zoma says, Eizehu Chacham, who is wise, someone who learns from every person. Not just from every person, but even from technology. So someone asked the rabbi, what can you learn from a train? Well, if you're late, you have to wait for the next train. Every minute counts. What can you learn from a telephone? He said, well, it's very easy. What you say here is heard over there in heaven. And what can you learn from a telegraph? That every word, every syllable matters and counts. And so when we take a look at the world around us, we have to realize that the world teaches us great wisdom, but we have to be willing to listen and learn from every person we meet. And now you know the rest of the story. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Okay, let's turn to page 166. Please rise. Elena Lishabel Ladon Hako. Take it, Lolly Yosef, Reishi. Hello, Sally Kukoye Abrasol. Hello, Samanu, Kumishabot Adama. Hello, Santokin Gohem, Go Elena Kukamolam. Manaf Nukomi, Ushtachavim, Umodim. Libnei Melech, Malchei HaMlachim. Akadosh Baruch Hu. Shuhum Notei Shamayim. Moshe Mikaro, Moshe Ushin Adonai, Ushin Adonai, Elohim Elohim, Hu Eloheinu Echad, En Emaskeinu Et Chulato, Hashatu Lechorato, V'yat Hayom, V'yat Hayom. V'ategonta Elohecha, Ki Adonai Hu Elohim, V'ashamayim Yima'al V'ha'aretz V'yitachadei Evod. Let's pray, dear friends, that God opens our heart to feel true and genuine humility and gratefulness for all the wonderful things that we have. Okay, well, we want to say Kaddish for those people we are remembering. And, my father used to say Kaddish for the 6 million. And the reason why was when he was in the camp, a lot of families were wiped out by the Nazis, as you know. And a fellow once told my father, he said, I have no one who's going to say Kaddish over me, but promise me, if you survive, will you say Kaddish for me and my family? And he honored that promise throughout his life. And so when we say the Kaddish, we are affirming a great unity that binds the generations together. The past is alive in us, and we contain the seed of the future. So as we say the Kaddish, let's remember the loved ones we have known, who we were blessed to have in our lives. I wish to say the Kaddish in memory of my son, Mendy, who died earlier this year, and my sister Jeannie, Jerry, my sister Jerry, who died almost a year ago. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabot, v'yamon devada chirutei, v'ylich malchutei, v'chayichon v'vimeichon v'chayei v'chol beit Yisrael, v'agol v'zman kori v'imur amein, yehei shmei rabba mevorach l'lam omer lamaya, v'yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ah v'yitruman v'yitnasei, v'yihadar v'yitali v'yitalal shmei l'kutsha b'rechu, le'elah kol v'chata v'shirata, v'shachata v'lahamata, da'amiran v'yamal v'imur amein, yehei shmom rabban shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'imur amein, Ose Shalom B'Ramav, Uyase Shalom, Aleinu Yisrael, B'Nu, Amen. Okay, I'd like Madam President, come up and make a few announcements.
Rabbi, thank you for your interesting drasha. It is always so interesting and educational and full of wit and humor.
Thank you.
Okay, so tomorrow, please join us at 10:30 for our services. Torah study, we'll have Kiddush afterwards. And Rabbi has his classes this week, and I'll let him tell you a little more about that.
Okay. We have a lot of new classes coming up. We're going to be doing a new series, not this week, but the following week, on the great works of Jewish mysticism. And we're going to be studying some very, very classical works. One book in particular I'm looking forward to teaching is a book called the Tanya, which is it's the major work of the Chabad Hasidic movement. But we'll also be studying some of the teachings of Rav Nachman of Breslov and some medieval works as well. It should be a very, very good series. I think you'll find it very interesting, and we may do more sessions on the Tanya, depending how interesting you find this subject matter to be. All right, okay, Tuesday night. Okay, this coming Tuesday, we're going to be studying the story of David and Bathsheba, and David's confrontation with the prophet Nathan. And we're going to be reading about the rebellion of Avshalom, who happens to be a very fascinating figure. You could say he's almost like a young version of David, except he's much more arrogant and cocky, but he takes after his father. And this man should have been the next king of Israel. So we're going to read about him and his downfall. We're going to be having a class on Wednesday night on love your neighbor as yourself. And we're going to be looking specifically at the laws of the Chafetz Chaim pertaining to not speaking gossip about your neighbor, and learning how, we got to remember that it isn't just what goes into the mouth that defiles, it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles as well. And this statement, of course, has been attributed to many famous people, including Maimonides and other figures we'll mention another time. And we hope you'll check out some of our programming. We have a class in beginner's Hebrew. In fact, we are finishing up the Hebrew book over the next 2 lessons, God willing. And we'll be starting another new class, and anyone interested in learning how to speak Hebrew. And we're going to be starting a class in conversational Hebrew and Siddur. And so our next goal is to train our graduates and to lead a service and have a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah. And that should be a really great program. Now, there's no limit to how much we can learn about Judaism. Judaism is an open book. Now, on the subject of humility, I just want to mention one last thing. As great as our world is, there's going to be a time in our world's history when we're going to burn up. And there probably won't be any recollection of who we are and what we stood for, other than the satellites we sent into outer space. And so when we take a look at this world against all the other planets, it's amazing how seemingly insignificant we are. So, but we want to make sure that you make those days count and that you fill your life with significance and purpose. Shabbat Shalom. Everyone please rise. Time for priestly benediction. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and protect you from all harm. Yair Adonai panav elecha v'chanecha. May lift His presence and be gracious to you. Yis Adonai panav elecha v'yosem v'chashlom. May God always look after you and give you the blessing of Shalom.